Human trafficking, unlike human smuggling, is a violation against an individual. It is either the commercial sexual exploitation of an individual through force, fraud, or coercion, i.e. selling someone for sex. This is your typical pimp-prostitute relationship. Or it is the recruitment of someone's labor through force, fraud, or coercion.
We are personally interested in it because our very own daughter was a victim of human trafficking, and it happened right here in our community and right under our noses. It happened many years, about 10 years ago. There was some friction in the home, and our daughter was angry with us, and but it actually started prior to that. She had met she was taking a bus home. She was going to a charter school, and she was taking a bus home, a city bus, and was approached by a young man as she was waiting for the bus who told her she was beautiful and asked her if she would be interested in modeling, gave her a business card, said he was a model agent, and she got on the bus and came home and was very excited to have this business card and be approached by this gentleman stating that he was a model agent. When my daughter handed me the card to share with me that this happened, I told her model agents don't hang out at bus stops, that it was ridiculous, that this wasn't a good guy, stay away. I took the card away, I threw the card away. Our daughter was a bit rebellious. She was 16 years old at the time, really wanting things her own way. And I thought that was the end of it. Sometime later, she asked to go to a concert at the Pima County Fairgrounds, and we asked her about what the conference was about, or I asked her. She gave us a slip of paper, and it was not something that was appropriate for her. And so we said no. She went anyway, and apparently the story that she tells us after that is that he was there, this man was there, and it was just shortly after that she literally packed all her bags and she was gone. We didn't know where she was. Wasn't very long later, about 2 weeks later, 2 weeks of not knowing where my daughter was, I got a call from the Phoenix Police Department that my daughter had been arrested for prostitution. And I drove that night, it was about midnight, I drove through the night, got her, and found her there in prostitute's clothes at the police department. They let me in a room with her that looked like it had a two-way mirrored glass, and I just had a conversation with her. I don't even remember, except that I was fairly in shock at what had happened. She looked hardened. She looked angry with me, but wanted to come home. And so they let her go. I'm not even sure that she was charged with prostitution. I know I got to bring her home. And about 2 weeks after that, she attempted suicide and was in a mental health ward, and that's when the story came out about what happened. The story that entailed afterwards was that my daughter was taken by this man to Phoenix, who promised her, of course, the world. She was still going to be a model. She'd run into him at the fair, but it was the next day that she really packed her bags and met him someplace, I don't know where, and he took her to Phoenix. He bought her clothes as he promised. He got her nails done. He got her hair done. Everything that was promised was being done. She was wined and dined, and then she was locked in an apartment. She wasn't allowed to talk to anybody. She wasn't allowed to use the phone. She wasn't allowed to look anybody in the eye if they came to the door. She was held hostage at that point. It was about a week after that incarceration in that hotel or apartment that she's introduced to the streets. And from her story, she spent about 2 days on the strip someplace in Phoenix. She doesn't know where she was. When I picked her up from the police station, she'd taken all her clothes with us, and I wanted to go get her clothes. We were advised to just go home, leave her clothes. I asked about pressing charges. There was no really charges to press according to the police department in Phoenix. And we were really advised, I was advised, take your daughter and go home. And so that's what I did. But she was on the streets about 2 days. She was turning tricks for about 2 days and just struggling with what was happening in her life. There was a police car driving down the road, and she was tucked inside a little doorway, kind of hidden, and just stepped out in front of the police car wanting to be arrested. And that's how we got her back, was through that arrest. For a couple weeks, actually, after the suicide attempt. She couldn't normalize herself back in school, none of which I understood. You know, I pretty much just thought, okay, you're home now. Go, be a kid again, go back to school, let's try to get our lives back together. And I was really trying to deal with it emotionally myself, because I had a daughter who left willingly. I was angry with that, and I just didn't know what to think about I didn't know what to think about any of it, really. I had no idea.
Didn't really have any resources.
My daughter even had a handful of cash when I picked her up there, and we talked about that money that was in her purse, and I made her leave it there. I made her leave it at the station, and in tears, she said, "Do you know what I had to do for that money? Do you know what I had to do for it, Mom? We're going to just leave it here now." And I thought, well, and I said to her, "Do you really think we can bring that money home, knowing what you had to do for it?" And so we just left it there, a big wad of money. You know, I was a working mom. I wasn't at home every day. So there was some difficulty after that. And my daughter it's been an uphill climb as far as recovery goes. When there was the suicide attempt, she went into therapy within the hospital, but I wasn't included in that. The family wasn't included in that. I have no idea what happened there. I just know that they released her, gave me a prescription for meds, and sent me home. They had some things in place for her, but there was never anything included for the family.
Mm-hmm. Nor any inclusion of anything that we could do, or signs that we should look for, or perhaps some strategies. It would be helpful to tactics even, in order to make her feel safe, or that this is not something we're holding against her, or anything that she has to feel guilty or shame about. Even nothing like that. And to this day, we really don't know if there's resources out there for stuff like that.
There's still behavior that exhibits trauma in her life. She's a wonderful girl, and we love her, and she's a wonderful mom. But there's that broken part in her spirit and in her
esteem
that causes her, we think, to make poor choices in some things that she does. Mm-hmm. Even she's in a marriage now that they're separated from one another, and in talking to her about reuniting with her husband, and there's a possibility that could happen. She doesn't want to do that, and what she says is, "I have too much of a past to be good in the future."
So when I was about 6 years old, my mom and dad had gotten a divorce, and my mom had went to work while I stayed with my uncle and my cousin, who was around 15 or 16 at the time. And usually he was pretty mean to me, and so we didn't really hang out. And he, that day in particular, my uncle was watching TV in the living room, and my cousin was talking to me, and he's like, "Hey, why don't I make you some food or something?" And so I was like, okay, I stopped what I was doing to go hang out with him. And then at that point, he made me lunch, and then he took me into my bedroom and told me that we were gonna play a game, and eventually wound up raping me that day. I already was feeling a ton of shame from what had just happened, very dirty and shameful. And then to compound that, my uncle basically told me that it was my fault and that I was doing something wrong, and that if my mom found out, I would be in trouble. So I didn't disclose it to my mom until a few years later. And from that moment on, I was going deeper and deeper within myself, trying to mask that pain, that initial pain that I was feeling. One, I didn't take very good care of myself at any point. My parents really had to fight with me to take showers and comb my hair and things like that. And I really had no self-worth. I was really acting out towards my father and telling him that I wanted him to die and that I hope he got hit by a truck anytime he would leave me. I was whining constantly. I started acting out in class a lot, talking way too much, getting sent to the back of the class, which just isolated me even further. And I started doing stuff like tying my shirt up so that my midriff would be showing, and stuffing my shirt so that it looked like I had breasts. I was chasing boys all the time and like trying to kiss them. All of this behavior was a pretty drastic change for me, and my friends really started to isolate from me because of my behavior, and the more that they would reject me, the more I would act out.
A foundational trauma of a child that's sexually abused, really what that means is that their ability to define for themselves what is a good relationship, what is a healthy relationship, is sort of taken away from them. If it's a family member, if it's someone close to the family, if it's someone that's like a family member, if it's a very trusted person in their life, it can really impact that for the rest of their lives. And so they're going to have, they're going to struggle a lot with being able to identify healthy relationships, being able to identify their own boundaries, and being able to be intimate with people in a way that is good and healthy for them as people.
During my teen years, I never saw myself living past 18. So I really hadn't thought about that kind of stuff in a really long time. And once we got our life started, it was kind of my way out, and I just put all of my faith and energy into my husband and my kids. I couldn't even do the dishes without having some type of intrusive thought, and I'd be driving in my car and be thinking about crashing into something and be scared that we were all going to die, and I would play out the whole thing, the ambulance coming and my kids being taken off on a gurney and me being at their funeral. Like, it was just all these really horrific thoughts. And it wasn't, and I mean, I know that people have those thoughts sometimes, but this was like a constant, like almost every free second, that's what I was thinking about. And I didn't know what was going on with me. But I hadn't dealt with any of the stuff that I had gone through, and so I was starting to spiral my own emotions and crazy antics were starting to spiral out of control. I was more asked about my symptoms and not really anything about my past. And so based on my symptoms, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and postpartum depression because I had just had a baby.
The service provider needs to have an understanding of sort of this foundational trauma, and rather than focus on behavior that maybe the person is doing right now, is really try and do and get an in-depth understanding of this person's past trauma that could be impacting the behavior.
I've done like a complete 180 just in the last 2 years, just from all of the understanding and education that I received about what abuse is, how it affects you, and how I could relate that to my own story. And I've started to be able to release all the shame that I had been carrying since that first time I got raped when I was 6.
Then we've got to ask our local government officials to put on the pressure and to provide the funding so our law enforcement can go after the perpetrators and to provide funding for the victims. There is no place in Pima County to put victims once they're rescued.
The women involved in this are victims of chemical abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse. They are dependent on their pimp for either home, shelter, food, drugs, whatever that may be. There are threats of violence. And so what struck me was that we are imprisoning the victims of the crime, and there ought to be a better way to do this.
I think there are great service providers in every community. I think the huge piece that we're still lacking is the community awareness piece.
Well, I mentioned identification of victims being the principal challenge in doing these investigations. Oftentimes, these are girls, and it's usually girls. There are boys who are victimized, but it's generally girls. But these are folks that you may see in your neighborhood. They may be your neighbor's child. They may be somebody that you used to see going to church on Sunday. Perhaps they were friends with your child in school. And there's been a change. You know, they've got this older controlling boyfriend now. They've socially isolated themselves. They've changed the way they're dressing. Maybe they're going to school less or dropped out completely. Perhaps they've got a handful of cash that they shouldn't have. All indicators that might say that this person could be in an exploitative environment or a situation. If the public calls law enforcement, it gives us a starting point to look. And I'm not suggesting that every troubled youth is going to be trafficked. But I'd rather look at more troubled youths to find the trafficking victims than ignore those sort of rabbit holes that we sometimes run down and miss victims. So we need the public support, we need the community support, and the willingness to sort of step up and say, hey, I think there might be something wrong. I don't know what, and just give us a pointer. So you might want to look at this little girl. I think she might be in trouble. Well, if you thought that person was in imminent danger, you're going to call your local police department or your sheriff's department.
Sure.
If you're not sure, if it's just somebody with some of these indicators and you're concerned, you can call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is run out of Washington, D.C., and it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline. They do receive a lot of tips in, and if you were to call that hotline, law enforcement here in Southern Arizona would receive that information back. Just raising that awareness and getting folks to be concerned about it and to pay a little more attention. And I'm not suggesting being hypervigilant, but just paying a little more attention and making a phone call if you think something's wrong.
Sure.
And I think that's really what we're not seeing here yet, is because even when I talk to law enforcement officers, they say, well, Eric, that doesn't exist here.
Right.
Well, it sure does. And the more we scratch at the surface, the more we find.
Sure.
But if you don't look for it, you're never going to find it.